Thank you, and thanks for attending my little talk. I'm actually going to do something I don't typically do, which is I'm going to go very quickly over a lot of slides. That I typically do. But I'm going to actually give more of a personal story than I typically do. So this is really just about, I think, in part, sort of my personal journey within Games for Change, but also to help you understand sort of how I've taken that and tried to expand it out to making larger and larger impact around the world. So obviously the title is Game Design to Heal Self, Society, and Community. So I'm a professor, game designer, artist, author, and developer of games. I've done so for years, including directing 2 academic game studios where I was trying to encourage students to produce the kind of work that we champion at places like Games for Change. The kinds of clients that are interested in this work are these as listed here. So we've done work for helping understand sort of management consulting issues to supporting things like the showcase of games at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Sam Arcade, as well as working in my foundation on news games and a variety of other sort of global issues. So I'm an awarded game designer over the years. I've also been a curator for a variety of sort of traditional art exhibits as well as sort of showcases. And I've co-authored or solo authored over 100 books, chapters, articles, and papers, primarily focused on game design, mostly recently moving towards misinformation and disinformation, but within the context of games. And the most germane here is the 2019 book, Doing Things with Games, Social Impact Through Play, and I'll reference some things in it, which is the only reason I'm explicitly mentioning it now. So I was also the founding director of a couple of games programs, or current director. I didn't found the University of Miami's program, but I did found American University's program and was one of the founding directors for, we got one of the alumni right here, and Miami University's program. So I'm also kind of sharing a perspective from developing curriculum around games and social impact. Lastly, I also serve as the Vice President for Higher Education Video Game Alliance. On Friday, we're going to announce our newest fellows, so you should come to the main stage for that. And with these fine people, we're basically championing the value of higher education video games. So I've served as judge and jury for a variety of organizations, including wonderful IndieCade, Games for Change, and the Independent Games Festival. I've won several career awards for this work. And I like to kind of help people understand how I got here, because I think at this phase in my career, it's sort of like, oh, where did this journey begin and where did it sort of go from there? So I started playing games because I loved games when I was about 4 years old. I started playing chess, absolutely loved it. And very close to that age, I also got really sick. So I spent a tremendous amount of time in the hospital as a child. And that really kind of, I think, shaped the way that I fell in love with games, because one of the rewards for going to phlebotomist, getting your blood drawn, was that you could get 10 minutes in the arcade in the hospital. It was a very clear sort of like dangling carrot, but I was absolutely into it and really excited about it. So I played games like this. And by about 8, I really couldn't afford games, obviously. 8-year-olds usually don't have a lot of work or money. But I absolutely loved them. And so I started making them myself by copying them out of magazines like Nibble. So you'll have a sense as to how old I am from this reference. Have any of you ever seen a 5 1/4 diskette in real life? Oh, wait, there's a couple. Wow, okay. So you've been to museums where they show them behind glass. And I really fell in love with programming. I really fell in love with the sort of rule sets. And one of the reasons I think I loved chess too was sort of a rule set that you had to operate within, and then you could do all kinds of things to play. And so what I ended up doing was really starting to write my own code by plotting scenes on graph paper, and then generating primarily sort of choose your own adventure video games, but they were basic video games. And I really found comfort in games. So I started this fake game company when I was a kid and tried to sell it to my friends, and a couple of them bought these games, but generally they weren't worth selling. But it really helped me understand the value of play. So a lot of this talk is actually about how powerful play is and how much I think we undervalue its effect and its ability to help us heal. So I've been arguing for years that play is actually one of the ways that we want to get things done. And I also think it's one of the ways, as you've seen from others, that we can actually understand another self or perceive another self. And it's also a way that we kind of see or envision a better future. So when we think of games, if you're unfamiliar with this project, it's Limitless. They're basically producing a game, Bionic Bash, that's helping kids get accustomed to working with prosthesis, or their new prosthesis. And that's out of Florida. And then it's really not merely about escaping from our present or past as we often describe games. It's something much more. And so in my book, Doing Things with Games, one of the things I frame is that games themselves are a set of problems and solutions. So designers create problems, and designers offer those solutions. In this case, this is how you can deal with a non-player character by squashing him or skipping him. And so one of the things I think it's important to recognize is that games and play are actually an opportunity to design a set of problems and their solutions. So when I describe games to people, I often say that they're just structured play to practice, experiment, and understand. And so you can kind of frame it as this is what a game is. And so games are often distinct from other media, and some people have a hard time describing this. And one of the things while I was working at American University really kind of came to me as a sort of an epiphany is that the easiest way to understand the difference between the media is to remember that readers read, and that is the core verb associated with it. Audiences watch, and players do. And it's that doing that's part of the healing process and actually part of the way that we get engaged in games. And so often when you ask people, one of the first questions about a game is, what do I do in that game? And so I emphasize that often. And so I think that one of the opportunities we're missing and we really need to champion is this idea of games as a structured way, not to just practice, experiment, understand, but also to heal. And so we do have games that are sort of explicitly focused on healing or focused on sort of healing through the imagination, envisioning a better future, envisioning a healthier self. And we have games about healing community. This is talked extensively at Games for Change, if you're unfamiliar with it. Half the Sky movement, great place to start. And we also have games about healing society. This is inequalityopoly. Does not roll off the tongue. I featured it in the third book I did on Black Game Studies. And I think it's a good example of trying to sort of like rectify the reality and give people some experience around things that need some healing around them. So I want people to understand that this is more than just the power of games to bring us together. We often talk about bringing community that way. But it's also about designing experiences that embrace playfulness, so giving you more of a contemporary game in this sort of space. And that playfulness is really kind of the benefit, because playfulness is actually quite useful in life. And when you look at something like, say, my career, as I just outlined to you, from this little kid who loved games to this person who stands in front of you and talks about games and travels the world talking about games, it would seem like it's quite linear, but it's absolutely not. This is kind of my fourth career. My real path looks like a complete mess, kind of like the way we play. And I would argue that that's actually a playful path. I'm interested in this, I'm interested in that, I go over here. And then I pull it back together to actually move in a positive direction. And so I think many people assume, and I've given this talk to sort of like, Pintar Genius School in Malaysia and startups in ed tech, but often it's sort of, you think it's this way, especially when you're young, and the reality looks like this. And that reality includes, for me, it was like I was a banking intern, I was in finance, I was in industrial supply for a while, I was a web developer, and eventually I became a game professor. And I actually think that while we recognize that there's no linear path, what we should probably be embracing is this notion of the playful path. So Bernie DeKoven, years ago before he passed, published this book, and really it was about helping people understand that there's actually quite a lot of value in playfulness, and that a playful path, as he sort of describes it, serves as a collection of ideas and tools to help us bring our playfulness back into the open. I think that depending on how you view the forces that shape the way that we work, it's sort of, we made playfulness the secret that you have to hide, put it in the basement, keep it somewhere else. But I actually think that he does a really good job of reminding us that when we find ourselves forgetting the life of the game or the game of the life, we can kind of employ a playful path. So when all else fails, I actually think it's really smart to try and be playful. There's a reason we say, let's like play with this idea, because we're not quite sure how to get forward any other way. And so many of you will probably recognize this one from my book and also from Csikszentmihalyi's flow diagrams. But basically, if you understand the state of play as that border, that space between anxiety and boredom, you start to understand what it means to make something playful. So the idea is that the sort of state of play is a playful path in itself. So if you think about boredom, it's what we do in the classroom that puts students to sleep. They're just sort of like, there's no skill required, or there's lots of skill required, or no skill required here, sorry, and no challenge. So it's not very interesting. And on the other side, anxiety is that experience I often describe in games where you're just like, I'm throwing this controller down. This is way too much for me. I'm not ready for this. This is too stressful. And so when we design games poorly, or look at life poorly, or look at it non-playfully, we end up in either one of these spaces. We end up bored but trudging through it, or we end up so anxious we don't know what to do next. And the ideal, in my mind, is to try and embrace that state of play, which is the same core concept Csikszentmihalyi offered as the flow state, right? It's between boredom and anxiety, and if you don't know this reference, shame on you, but you should check it out. And I think it's important to recognize that we're trying to aim for this sort of this space, this flow space, across a variety of the practices that we're engaged in. Not just art practices, but medical practices. Everything we do requires us to sort of have that hyper focus and manage our anxiety and boredom so we can actually achieve what we want to achieve. And so I do think that play states are flow states. And I think one of the easiest ways to think about it is to go, wow, there's 3 billion game players worldwide. And for years, I've been trying to argue that we need to stop solving little imagined problems in games because I think those fictions are wonderful, but we have so much more propensity to solve bigger problems by applying those same contexts to real-world issues. So we know that things like remission, an old reference in the health space, has been useful in encouraging pediatric medical compliance, so addressing big medical problems like that. But we also know that there are medical training games where we're kind of addressing medical training problems through playfulness, and those are very direct solutions. Similarly, we see it in games in medical education. There's sort of all these sort of serious games or simulations that are trying to do that kind of work. But we also recognize that we can do big computational work. So Folded is a perfect example of a games with a purpose or human computation game. We're using the engine of gameplay, the people playing and solving problems to solve real-world issues. And so I think one of the things contemporarily that we forget is that games can also be extremely useful in training AI. So we've talked about games in the human computation space training other people, and we've talked about it as improving other spaces, but I think it's important to recognize that it also can improve AI. So if you look at the universe of AI problems, I think one of the most important ones that games have evidently contributed to is perception. And so if you think about perception, we have very specific examples like basically tower defense mechanics used to identify macular degeneration, which is such a super esoteric but very specific solution. And we have things like malaria spots, which is sort of the citizen science approach where we look at data and then help people play through identifying specific elements. And 150,000 people played that. And there are other games that human computation games that are about mapping the human brain. And then we see that they're used in commercial spaces. When I was curating Games for Change a couple of years ago, we brought in the Borderlands people from Gearbox to talk about how they've been integrated these DNA strands analysis, human computation in games to improve data sets. But I think the super exciting idea in the AI future that may be coming is the idea that we can actually play for AI, and that our playfulness is the most human thing we can do, and by playing, we're actually adding or augmenting what many non-playful systems, aka computing systems, can't do. And so I think one of the ways to look at play is to recognize that it may be the future of work, especially in doing things like training AI-supported systems. So a bigger version of playing with ideas, but in this context, really playing with systems that help us interrogate AI. Or data sets. So I think it's important to recognize that games themselves encourage us to optimize our analysis skills. That's part of that border between anxiety and boredom. And that we are often far more focused in games than we are in other tasks. And so I think we need to continue to design experiences that are outside of the sort of real world but are capable of affecting it. We call these in the human computation space isomorphs. So we take something and we reapply it in a context that doesn't make it feel as mundane as a simulation. And I think there's a ton of opportunity in that space. I've been championing it for years. And I also think that it's important to recognize that when we think about data analysis, for example, playful data analysis should be more common than it is. And so one of the projects a couple of years ago, for 2 years, the National Cancer Institute was running these sort of data viz workshops. And so they brought games people like me in to have these conversations. We also recognize that games can help with balancing experimentation and real-world consequences. Also mentioned previously at Games for Change, See Hero Quest, which basically was a sort of opportunity to data mine so that we could affect data on dementia. And I do think that often we realize that play is about work. Play is work. It's just a kind of work that we've thrown in the basement and said, no, this is an exception to the standard work rule. And that play is really about working optimally. So if we try and work well, we will be working in a play state. and that we can actually use games as assessments, as we've done before. So this is an old project we did with ETS, where we converted the work of testing into play. So instead of having one-on-one interviews about what we call sociopragmatics, we actually had this game that helped assess those sociopragmatics, knowing the right words to say in the right context, given a social dynamic. But the core concept is really that when you think about what you do when you fail at a game, it is very different than non-game context or non-playful context. You just try again, right? Like that's what we do. You pick it up and try again, and it's that pervasive intent that sort of I'm going to keep trying, that I think we need to embrace. And part of it is focus, and part of it is just that mental state of play. And so I think it's important to recognize that games are often safe by design. We create a game world. It's outside the real world. And we create multiple game worlds to allow people to create an experiment. And I think we can very much employ this in a variety of contexts. So I always encourage people, personal journey, to make a bad game. I've made lots of bad games. I've published about how bad those games were. I admit they weren't good games. I even made games about healthcare that weren't very good games, but I tried. And I think that the idea that we fail, the playful state we have to appreciate, is this idea that because it's iterative design, I learn more from my failures. So I practice and practice and practice because I learn more from my failure than my success. So we've learned from social impact that what I've learned about social impact from making games is that it's much more like playing a piano, which is about practice and trying over and over again, and you have to find the joy in the practice. Which I think sometimes people forget. So I love game jams for this reason. I've written about how I actually think that they're much more analogous to a jam session, like playing music, and that we have this sort of great orchestra with people who are designers, developers, artists, and we just work together over a weekend. I think that it's important to recognize that jamming is really just a great way to encourage a play state, a low-risk environment, and outside the regular world environment, and give us a space to work together. We've got other publications this year that are explicitly about how people feel better about their social impact understanding of a topic than they do about their game development from a game jam. So we actually did these sort of controlled studies where we found that they were like, wow, I'm learning way more about social impact than I am about game design. And we've done this kind of work before, so this is some of the work we did in Malaysia, healing community after the pandemic. And we've done this work, obviously I mentioned the DataViz Center at NCI, and we've tried to do things like create mental health games. We've tried to do things like identify fact from fiction. Factitious was one of the projects we did at American years ago. But also, while I've been in Miami, helping people understand immigration policy by letting them play through it, because it's a very complicated system, so playing through it helps you understand it very quickly. And understanding that people don't just play for escape, but they actually play to support each other. This is kind words, to play with coping with loss, as actually some of the earlier sessions had actually talked about, and to help people understand that there's really an opportunity to work together to solve problems. So this is from the Waisili Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative event that we did 2 years ago, basically Kuala Lumpur with all the ASEAN nations. We basically hosted a bunch of jammers from 75 different places, and they all worked together and solved really big social impact issues. And so we've worked around empowering positive social change through these kinds of activities. And then we've published strategies for combating disinformation and misinformation, things that destroy communities, try to produce formulas for it, just so you have a sense for them. We've also done stuff around showing you how this actually works, doing real-world case studies. We've tried to foster conversations about fostering play-based change, as well as an appreciation for the value of play fundamentally. And so the secret to games that heal is really just the secret to games that improve lives, that really do anything, and that's the secret of play. Because play has the ability to help us see the world differently, to understand and empower good health decisions. And when I wasn't really escaping when I was generating games, what I was doing was hoping for a better future. And I think that games themselves help us hope for a more playful future, a future that's about hoping to explore other spaces, imagine a better world, or heal as a reason to keep playing. That's everything, and that was 19 minutes.